for many different things. The first is the ability of the US to prosecute a non-US citizen for committing the act of journalism. The second is the extraordinary coordination between different states to persecute an ordinary citizen. Is the complete and utter breakdown of the rule of law in Britain, as we can see, Muslim prisoners have seen for a very long time within the justice system. And it is also an important chance for us as activists to come together to shape the kind of world and the kind of politics we want to see. So it is my pleasure, on behalf of Carol and Stephen and the organisers of this event, to introduce to you somebody whose blogs are hugely widely read. My husband probably spends more time with Craig than he does with me. Let's quickly say that he was Britain's ambassador to Uzbekistan, turned whistleblower, lifting the lid on extraordinary rendition and the crimes that were taking place with the knowledge of the British state. And Craig's unfortunately double booked himself today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to him. Craig's not going to use the mic, but he projected in this massive church that we had our event in London. So I'm sure he'll be more than able to project here, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It will become a Scots Defend ASSANGE organisation. I'm here, I live in Edinburgh, and I value any activities going forward. That having been said, I have double booked myself today. I'm meant to be speaking simultaneously to you and to a branch of the SNP at 2 o'clock. I was actually going to cancel the latter one, but then 3 days ago the Times ran an article saying anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist Craig Murray to address SNP. So after that I couldn't really cancel. Because so many people are going to come because of the Times article. So I am going to have, unfortunately, to speak to you very quickly here, then dash off and speak to another meeting. And I apologise, it's not very satisfactory. And I think it's because of Bernstein. I think everyone's having their meetings in the afternoon instead of in the evening, so they need to get rooted tonight. I feel quite emotional on the subject of Julian, because Julian is, of course, not just a colleague and a great activist, but is someone who's a personal friend. And the suffering through which he's been put, and the state he was in the last time I saw him in court in London, really was a matter of extreme concern to me. And to see that happen to somebody you care about is a dreadful thing. We have a small, very small victory, but every victory is to be prized, in that from being held in solitary confinement and is being allowed to meet with other prisoners and talk to people. That, I'm sure, will have a very, very beneficial effect on his health. And it came about because of essentially a prisoner revolt within Belmarsh, where the other prisoners insisted. I think it says a very great deal when the actions of the state are so cruel and evil, and where the prisoners in a high security jail have a greater feeling for morality than the UK state. I think that tells us a very, very great deal. But anyway, so that's slightly better news. And of course what we must all carry on with is the campaign to get him out of jail completely and to end this extradition process. Julian is a publisher. Julian is not and would not claim to be a whistleblower. Julian is somebody who has published secrets, government secrets, which were given to him by whistleblowers. And the ability for us to know what our governments are doing is essential. The British state forfeited any claim on our trust or any claim to be able to hold secrets from us when it told us it had firm intelligence on Iraqi WMD, which we were not allowed to see, but which plainly country in 45 minutes. Most of us here, I'm quite sure, never believed that for a moment anyway, but that fiction, magnified by the media, was the basis on which a war was started in which millions of people died. And the consequences of that war carry on. The Middle East is still in a state of crisis and disaster as a result of those events. And yet we are told that the government is safe, it's trustworthy, it must have secrets. It alone has the knowledge of how to interpret the intelligence material it has. This is mostly nonsense. I spent over 20 years in the Foreign Office. 6 of those years I was a member of the senior management structure of the Foreign Office. I was an ambassador. A very high proportion of the intelligence which government receives is simply, and officials know it to be untrue. Most of the dossier on Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, if I can take that as an example, did actually contain mostly intelligence material, which MI6 had procured. And when I say procured, I mean procured, bought. When I was in the British Embassy in Warsaw, for example, one of the jobs I had there was to get cash from the embassy account and hand it to the local head of the MI6 station for him to go and pay informants. And when I say cash, I mean, you know, £200,000 at a time, that kind of cash. And very often, and there was one occasion when I had lunch myself with a Polish politician I knew, and we got drunk and told each other stories, which is what diplomats do for a living. And then 2 days later, I received an intelligence report containing the same stories. And it turned out that the day after I had got drunk and had lunch with this Polish politician, the head of MI6 in Warsaw had got drunk and had lunch with him and heard the same stories. The only difference was he handed over £50,000 for it, whereas I got it for nothing. And I should say the stories were equally untrue on both occasions. But that is how most intelligence works. Forget James Bond. If I can ever in your minds, when I was British ambassador in Tashkent, we did not have an MI6 station there. And the reason we did not have an MI6 station was that MI6 said that Tashkent was too dangerous on their health and safety assessment. This notion that there are great stores of government secrets that must be kept safe and that WikiLeaks are a danger to society, and that's the notion which is being peddled by government in this extradition case, is an absolute. Specific leaks for which Julian is being extradited are the leaks of Chelsea Manning, which revealed war crime after war crime after war crime in Iraq and in Afghanistan. We need the ability to see the truth. We need the ability to see what is really happening. The media, the mainstream media, is less and less inclined to publish the I don't think that we've ever seen such a convergence among the corporate and state media as we saw during the last election campaign. The idea that we live in any kind of meaningful democracy when we have so little ability to convey different ideas, to convey actual truth rather than what the BBC and the Daily Mail say, all of the sources of information. There are very few threats to that. There are very few threats to that. I myself run a website, as you may know. Do you know, over 90% of the traffic to my website arrives via Facebook or Twitter to American corporations. And occasionally, one or the other decides to switch me off because they don't like something I've said. 90% of the time, that's because of something I've published on Israel. That seems to lead then to an automatic switch off almost immediately. The switch off tends to last 5 or 6 days, but American corporate, even what we think are outposts of freedom on the internet, are subject to choking by American corporate gatekeepers. This is a serious, serious problem in society. I know of no one who has a better handle of these things than Julian. I know of no one who did more to establish the internet as a direct way of getting out truth than Julian. If you look at WikiLeaks' continuing work, I hope you've all followed the whistleblowers at the OPCW who have shown us for certain, there's no doubt, because there's documentary evidence and eyewitness evidence, that the OPCW falsified a report on the use of chemical weapons in Duma, and they falsified a report in order to try to start a war. Indeed, reports were falsified in order to start a war with Iraq. These things go round and round. WikiLeaks have been able to expose it. Yet, with the and I should be fair and give due credit to Peter Hitchens, who has done excellent work on the subject. Other than that, the fact of the exposure of the OPCW fraud simply been blocked from the mainstream media. You would never know it, because we are living in a world where the mechanisms of control are getting ever stronger. Some are comparatively subtle, like the propaganda model of media and the control of information. Others are much less subtle. I've been organising a meeting for the 4th of February in Chatham House in London, designed to, at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, designed to discuss the whole issue of WikiLeaks and Julian, and which has, we invited speakers with whom we do not agree at all, so we could have a debate and invite a lot of senior people to it. One of the speakers was even to be former head of MI6. And the Royal Institute of International Affairs yesterday cancelled that because they would not hold a meeting on the subject of Julian Assange. The Assange campaign in London, run by John Rees, have had both a church and a university cancel rooms for Julian Assange meetings within the last the area of permitted speech is getting smaller. We've seen Extinction Rebellion added to the Prevent programme. I find it very difficult to speak in a university nowadays. When I go speak at a university, the people inviting me, by and large, have to fill out form after form after form on the Prevent programme, because I apparently am a dangerous extremist. Very dangerous to what? Is a kind of repression that puts a publisher into solitary confinement for months simply for the crime of publishing the truth. We have a hard fight. We know from the result of the last election, we know from the tide of right-wing authoritarianism which is riding high in the world, we know it is not a fight we are currently winning, but it is a fight that has to be fought. It's part of a long, hard struggle for freedom. And in that struggle for freedom, we need Julian. Because not only is Julian a victim of injustice, Julian is one, and I know that we're all going to work very, very hard and to raise public awareness and to make people understand the fundamental issues for freedom of speech which are raised by this extradition process. I am really, really sorry. I do have to run away, and I literally have to run away. I have to run out the building. But thank you so very much for listening to me, and I do hope I'll see you again at future events. Thank you.
That was a typically juicy and interesting Craig speech, and he is right. It is amazing how the suppression of dissent spans even the supposedly critical realms of our society, including universities where knowledge is supposed to run free. And I can say that as a university lecturer who's found it extremely difficult to book places to hold ASSANGE events in London. Before we go on to our next speaker, with the kind help of Beth Bogarts, we have a small video, which is an edited version of the collateral murder video, to highlight the kinds of things that Julian exposed. So let me get there. Beth for putting that video together. Our next speaker is a fellow academic who taught economics and has a particular interest in health and PFI, but has spent quite a lot of time in the past few years campaigning on the ground for Julian Assange. She's part of the Committee for the Defence of Julian Assange, based out of London, Helen Mercer.
Thank you very much for organising this meeting, Caroline, Stephen and Deepa. I'm here really to bring greetings from the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, and you might be aware that concurrently with this meeting is a major protest and vigil outside Belmarsh Prison. And I don't know if many of you have had the pleasure of going to Belmarsh, but it's one of the bleakest and most desolate places on God's earth, outside as well as in. And they're joined. So they're a grassroots organisation, and at its core are people who stood outside the Ecuadorian embassy for years on end, in all weathers, to offer support to Julian Assange. Now, the Ecuadorian embassy, that organisation has grown enormously, and I was one of the recent recruits. I'm ashamed to say I was not there for years, deeper. I've been there since April, but it's been wonderful to see how the movement has grown. And we're the people you will see outside the court, outside Belmarsh. We provide a lot of the backup for major events like Deepa's Free the Truth. And out of us have come several local organisations, like, I hope, Scotland Must Resist. We've got ones in Greenwich and Lewisham, which is where I'm from, and Belmarsh is in the London Borough of Greenwich. There's one in the Isle of Wight, amazingly, one in Oxford, and there are ones being set up in the north of London, around Muswell Hill. And the Don't Extradite Assange campaign has also started now, which is like the official campaign of WikiLeaks. But in lots of ways, JADC, the Committee to Defend Julian Assange, are the boots on the ground. And you can go on their website and find out a lot of what's on. I really just wanted to give a few quick thoughts about what is involved in campaigning, because I think that's really what you wanted me to talk about. And I wanted to just say that when you set up your group and you really start campaigning, it's a difficult campaign, because the lies and the smears against Assange have been very, very effective. And that means that we primarily have a huge job of persuasion. And I think the first thing that's therefore very important is for ourselves to grasp just what sort of material WikiLeaks revealed, WikiLeaks published, to know the range. We've given some idea here. But I think to summarise it quickly, a lot of what Assange, what WikiLeaks has published are activities by governments, by corporations, which would not stand up to public scrutiny. And therefore the next step of governments and corporations is to ensure that such scrutiny cannot occur. And that is the central point of the campaign on Assange, to allow that sort of public scrutiny to occur of what our leaders are doing. The US wants to, not because of some alleged misconduct in Sweden, but because of the publication and the true body count in the Iraq War. And of course we have to remember it's not just those things that WikiLeaks has released. Many people forget that WikiLeaks published the draft TTIP treaty, which I don't know if many of you are aware of, but it was a treaty, a free trade treaty between the EU and the US, which they were trying to do hugger-mugger. And the release of that material was important to the campaign. Also environmental crimes have been revealed. And we have to ask whether it's a coincidence that Assange was imprisoned in Belmarsh at about the same time as we now know that the plots to assassinate General Soleimani were beginning to thicken. And we have to ask also why journalists around the world are being pursued and arrested. People not only like Assange, but people like Glenn Greenwald, Max Blumenthal. And is such a repression connected with the growing move to war and the recent revelation that the nuclear clock is now edging very, very close to midnight? So we're entering a very dangerous phase, and the treatment of Assange is, to me, the canary in the mine. And that, I believe, is why so many people are now getting involved. Just to get back to the campaigning issue, I think these points give an idea of the sort of people who will join the campaign. Because when Greenwich and Lewisham campaign started up, we drew on people who have been involved in the health campaign, starts with, to develop the campaign. And I think it's worth remembering that trade unions are also very important in playing a role there. It's often forgotten that one of the key things that the TTIP treaty, for instance, revealed was the concerted attack against trade unions. I wanted just to quote from, there's a very good publication by the Courage Foundation on WikiLeaks and labour rights. And it's a point that's often missed. So I just wanted to quote from Unison about their comment on TTIP, and they said, "We are opposed to its threats to regulatory standards, which will affect our members by restricting employment and trade union rights and threaten health and safety legislation. Lastly, we are worried about its potential effect on climate change and the environment." And I think that trade unions are very important to get involved. There was a very important statement by the NUJ, which is always worth quoting. So, I don't know what to get on to now. Let me just see, sorry. So the other thing I wanted to raise was that it's very important to organisations to inform ourselves about the case of Assange itself. When I first got involved, I spent hours, if not days, on the internet because I wanted to be satisfied in my own mind as to what had happened in Sweden, which I'm sure you're all aware of what's said about it. And I was personally convinced that it was something like entrapment. And when humanity becomes apparent, and the US and Swedish and British governments have operated with complete law and in national and international law. And I wanted to highlight particularly the case of Ecuador, where a loan from the IMF of $4.5 billion was signed just a couple of months before they agreed to allow. I thought it might be appropriate at this time and place to quote a bit of Robbie Burns, because Assange was literally bought and sold for American gold, and we've seen parcels of rogues across multiple nations. So once you have your core of activists, then what sort of work is there to do? And I think a lot of the work is support for Assange himself. That can take the form of vigils, of leafleting, obviously. But I wanted to mention a couple of groups it's really worth approaching. The first are churches and religious groups. And we recently had a very successful meeting, the first meeting with a church group in Piccadilly in London. And the other group are artists who have taken a great deal of interest or admiration for the personal integrity and courage, not just of Julian Assange, but of other people as well. Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden as well, I'd include in that. And I think that speaks particularly to artists who want to be involved and express this through their work. John Reardon, who is a lecturer at a local college, he did a monument to Chelsea Manning, which is very moving. And the Isle of Wight group, when they first started up, they started up with an exhibition of artwork. And then there is all the publicity and mobilisation. There are motions that you can find on the Wise Up website, writing to MSPs. I don't know if anybody's tried. When we wrote to the Labour Shadow Cabinet, we got not one single reply. So anyway, good luck with the MSPs. And then we also attend various meetings which are related to the releases by WikiLeaks. So peace events, anti-war movement, environment endorse it. I see the fight as not just a fight for the freedom of press, but a central part of a wider defence of democracy, of social justice and of peace. So I wanted to end with a clip, I think, if you got it, of a member of our Greenwich group who we all posed a question to Greenwich Council. They have some responsibility for prisoners in Belmarsh. And she made a point at a council meeting. Now, this is the person who stood outside Belmarsh.
A group of people with me representing the Julian Assange campaign. I put in a question to council and I received a brief but sympathetic reply. Thank you very much. Will the council bring to the attention of the appropriate authorities the case of Julian Assange, who has been designated by the UN Rapporteur on Torture as being in arbitrary detention and a victim of psychological torture, if not physical as well, and whose condition appears to have deteriorated since being in Belmarsh prison, as demonstrated in his recent court appearance at Westminster Magistrates Court. We are very seriously concerned that he will not get a fair trial and may not even survive his Belmarsh. In your response to my initial question, in the final paragraph, you state the prisons and social care team highlights issues as they come across them. Highlights issues as they come across them. So does that mean the council is aware of the plight of Julian Assange?
So I just wanted to give you an example of how difficult it is, which was really great, which wasn't just us. But the rustling, the foot shuffling by the Labour councillors, by all the councillors in that chamber, was something to behold. And I have to also say that in neighbouring Lewisham, when Piers Robson, who's exposed a lot of material on OPCW, when he was due to hold a meeting, that was cancelled. They had to shift venues for that particular meeting as well. So just to give you an example, it's a very hard struggle, but I think things are really developing now with the movement gathering pace internationally and Britain. And I wish you every success in your adventure.
And the team of people who are standing outside Belmarsh right now, I believe there are about 300 Julie watching this via Gordon's wonderful live feed. So our solidarity to you in your struggle. And our thanks to you for doing the work on the ground. Thank you very much. To all those people who stood at the vigils, to all those people who stood outside the embassy, to all the people who come to our meetings in the rain and the wet, to the people who hand out leaflets, and to the people. As a trade unionist myself, the rise of identity politics means that some of the issues that surround Julian Assange's case have not been probably discussed within the broader left, and especially within the trade union movement. And I am quite pleased to say that the MEA as well as the NEJ have finally come out in support of Julian, and that is a welcome step. I'd also like to point out to you that the young people, the wonderful young people who are energised by the Extinction Rebellion movement, might be a good place for you to start having these political conversations. And of course, Scotland is probably a little bit more progressive than we are in England, so. Carol and Stephen have received the cat later.
Evening, and just say thank you for that.
Yes, please.
When people leave, I've printed off a whole lot of posters of the drawings that I've done of Assange. I'd like people here to wallpaper fucking Scotland with them.
Thanks, Dan. Could I now introduce someone who is an activist whose work is local to the borough that I live in, but has had national significance. Somebody whose voice in the struggle that you clear his name when he has not even been charged, to be in a refugee in asylum and yet not be allowed by the Foreign Office to go and get treatment for an abscessed tooth or a hurting shoulder, despite the Ecuadorian embassy requesting permission for him to be allowed to go to a hospital and return to the embassy. In all of this, the biggest smears have been around the rape allegations in Sweden. And to dispel them, I'd like to invite somebody who's not here to defend Julian Assange, but is here, their names to be taken, the rape and harm that they have suffered to be used as a tool to persecute a journalist. And I'd like to welcome Lisa Longstaff.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having us here today. I'm really pleased to be having the privilege to meet with you. So I'm from an organisation called Women Against Rape. We're based in London, and our view is that the pursuit of Julian Assange is not about rape. It's the US government distorting rape and witch hunting him as a cover to extradite him so they can punish him for what he's done as part of WikiLeaks, which includes exposing war crimes, rape and torture. Now, As far back as 2010 and 2012, we had pointed it out in the press to the unusual zeal with which they went after him. It's unlike any other rape case we've ever seen. We've demanded justice, we've demanded protection, and we've demanded compensation, including women seeking asylum. In the UK, although reports of rape have quadrupled in 4 years, charging has dropped from 14% to 2.5%. Negligent and biased investigations and prosecutions have been widespread in our experience from the cases that women bring to us, and that speaks volumes about how rape is dealt with by the authorities and the value put on our safety as women and as young girls. So the current excuse for this is the cuts. The criminal justice system is overwhelmed and understaffed, and I'm sure that's true. I think it is in a real mess. But domestic abuse and domestic murder are not better treated. We've seen thousands of pounds going into anti-terrorism, into Prevent, etc. It's already been mentioned that even Extinction Rebellion's been put on the list of people to be reported as extremists. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But 15 times more people get murdered in the UK through domestic violence incidents than through terror attacks. Most of them are women. What about the terrorism that women are facing daily when you're in a violent relationship? Every resource has been thrown at persecuting, guarding, prosecuting and extraditing Julian Assange at great cost to the taxpayer, for which he's then been blamed. In his case, the judicial process was corrupted from the beginning. I just want to compare how he's been treated to how women that we how the women have been treated, compared to how women we deal with have been treated. The people who want to torture him are themselves rapists, racists and murderers. They are the people that are running the establishment. And this sets a terrible precedent for journalists and whistleblowers everywhere. The British media has to take a lot of the blame for what's happened to Julian Assange. And they've basically turned on him and taken part in the US hiding the US and UK murder and rape in which many countries participated. People have then been invited to join this witch hunt. The case against him is not based on evidence. That's become so distorted that it's almost irrelevant now. And obviously now the case has been dropped. Thousands of rape cases right here have had perfectly good evidence and yet been closed. While the Swedish case, which was clearly railroaded by the state prosecutors there, with much weaker evidence than many we've worked with cases, was pursued by this corrupt international alliance. We've also worked with thousands of rape victims who are seeking asylum from rape and torture in other countries. We witnessed British governments accusing women of lying and deporting them with no together with Black Women's Rape Action Project during the Iraq, including torture, including rape, under the US-UK occupation, and not one of them responded. Chelsea Manning, I'm glad, has been mentioned. She is currently in prison again, despite the President Obama having commuted her sentence last time around, and they are using WikiLeaks as a way to torture her as well. The leaks that Chelsea Manning is accused of providing do expose rape and torture and other war crimes around the globe by the US military, particularly in Afghanistan, in Bosnia and Iraq. Don't those victims count as well? That's what we'd like to say to those people who are calling him a rapist, Julian Assange. Now, Chelsea was detained in solitary in May, a month before Assange was arrested, and she refused to testify to a grand jury against Julian Assange. She's being fined $1,000 a day for refusing to testify. We must get them both freed. Speaking out against the grand jury, Chelsea Manning said, "In solidarity with many activists facing the odds, I will stand by my principles. I will exhaust every legal remedy available. My legal team continues to challenge the secrecy of these proceedings, and I am prepared to face the consequences of my refusal." Now that's a principled movement person we need to defend. It's a dark and lonely place being in prison like that, both in solitary. So please, please write to both these people, to Chelsea and to Julian, and please campaign to get both of them out and gather support from other people and get the information out there to explain how they've been witch hunted and maligned and lied about. You can get the address from me afterwards if you need places to write to them at. We have to save both their lives, and we have to do all we can to bring them both home, because in saving their lives, we're saving our own. Both Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning have already suffered years of isolation, confinement, imprisonment, public vilification and humiliation, longer and more shaming than many men convicted of rape. Just as Niels Meltzer said, this is setting a precedent. Once again, women's fury and frustration at the injustices of suffering violence and rapists seeing rapists go free in almost every case is being manipulated by governments for their own purposes. Sending someone to their death or 175 years in prison and torture for espionage has nothing to do with justice, and certainly isn't justice for rape. I just want to say one other thing about the case, the Swedish case, if I may keep you a little bit longer. I mentioned earlier that this was corrupted from the start, and I just want to say how that has happened, or how that's played out. Rape victims have the right to anonymity, and defendants have the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court. Those are both crucial to justice. But in Assange's case, justice has been perverted. On the one hand, the names of the women were circulated on the internet and they were trashed. Their allegations were dismissed as not real rape by some people. People who have wanted to defend Assange have sometimes cussed out women in general, or said that there's loads of false rape allegations being made, and it undermines Assange to do that, okay? It puts women off joining the campaign to save him as a journalist, because we're always listening for when people are attacking us. You know, women have an ear for, is this in my interest? Are these people on my side or not? Obviously, everybody does. I think he should be hung because he's a rapist. It's just, that's mob rule, that's not justice, and that's not what we stand for as a nation. And it's been clear that both the UK and the Swedish governments, with the backing of the US, have been pursuing him for ages to get him extradited. We said this back in 2012, maybe even 2010. And he's been constantly smeared. It's been a sustained witch hunt, and it's had an effect, as people have said. When you speak out publicly, other people then start accusing you of this, accusing you of that. But as people have said, it's time now to grow the campaign. We have to save him. We have to stop him being extradited, because it's not in any of our interests for that to happen. Thank you.
For the activists here, I'd like at this stage to draw your attention to two bits of information. One, or rather a fight for the freedom of information, that was a campaign led by an Italian journalist called Stefania Maurizi, who publishes in La Repubblica, and she's shown how the Crown prosecution service has actually told the Swedish prosecutors not to come to Britain to interview Julian Assange, so as to delay, his ability to clear his name. They've said, don't you dare get cold feet. That was the phrase. Don't you dare get cold feet, when the Swedish prosecutors said they didn't have the evidence to be able to charge him. So this is a situation where the state machinery in Britain, in Sweden, in America is being corrupted and state accountability is being undermined. And to talk about this further, we were supposed to have Kerry Ann Mendoza, but we're going to have two videos, one from Anna Brees and the other from, do we have the other one as well? From Sheka Horvat. So.
I want my message today to be one of hope. I do a lot of work with whistleblowers and also with victims and survivors of abuse, and I teach them how to use the simple mobile phone, like I'm doing now, to film, edit and broadcast in exactly the same way I used to when working as a journalist at ITV and also at the BBC. Now, well, they can do what I used to do. In fact, I met a BBC reporter the other day who's filming and editing on his mobile and it's going straight to BBC One. So my question then is, why can't we do it? Well, we can. We have a chance now to be heard. And for those stories that I believe are hidden in the darkness for so long, we can now bring them into the light. I call it new media, not social media, where we can all communicate the vulnerable, where we can vote for new leaders, we can watch and create our own new media. We have the power now to create a world that we want and we are proud of for our children and our future generations. Now, Julian's been in Belmarsh since April, and in that time I have seen change, and I've seen positive change. Whistleblowers coming forward, victims of injustice and abuse getting stronger, sharing their stories and being heard, and this cannot stop. The people are rising up and they're taking control. Julian, a message directly for you. Should you ever hear it, you gave us all the confidence to do this. To me, you personally affected me, to be brave and to care, to show compassion and selflessness, and to put other people's needs before our own. And we're doing that for the greater good, for our fellow man, and that's the spirit that lives on, and it's getting stronger thanks to people like you, Julian. And we need him to be freed. We need him to help us continue with this very important work. And I don't think no more people are hiding behind so-called professionalism or for fear of shame or being different or standing up and shouting, no, this is not okay. Well, we can do it. Wherever you work, whether that can expose injustice, corruption and abuse, it's a responsibility of everyone, set by the example of Julian Assange, something that he'll always be remembered for. And whatever happens to you, Julian, no one can ever take that away. I will finish with a few of my favourite quotes of Julian's. Get your mobiles out and start telling the world the truth.
I'm really glad to be in your room tonight. Well, I'm also glad that you are here in this room, although you're not really in this room, and I'm not really in that room. And it's not really my room, and that's also not your room. But anyhow, what I want to say is that we live in a fiction, that we still live in a secure world. And the fact that I'm here in this room, which is not my room, and you're in that room, which is not your room really, doesn't mean that tomorrow you might not end up without any room at all. And that's a reality for millions and very soon billions of people on this planet. If you look at the situation today with the Australia fires, 1 billion animals who perished, the reinforcing loop of climate crisis, which you can see now in Australia, but also other developments in the world. I mean, from permafrost to the melting ice to the tensions between Iran and United States, to the ongoing civil war in Libya, whatever the world leaders say, to the meeting in Davos. What you can see is that the world leaders themselves are becoming aware that all of this, might soon be just a nice fantasy. This stability of a world, the fact that a world still exists. Whose voice is missed in this situation? Whose voice is missed not just because his thoughts would give us a better understanding of the situation, but his revelations would give us the very facts which we can use then in order to change the situation. This voice, of course, is the voice of Julian Assange, who is not in a room like this or that today, but he is in a high security, maximum high security prison in UK, in London. I've seen him a few months ago for the last time, and of course it was very difficult, but at the same time what I can say is that even in this kind of very difficult situation, and it's the most difficult situation I have ever seen, my friend, even in this kind of situation, Julian has resilience. He has, this kind of resisting spirit, which you can rarely find. You can rarely find it because almost everyone is corrupted, almost everyone is thinking just about security and not about freedom. And Julian Assange was constantly thinking about freedom, fighting for our freedom, and in the end he ended up as the one without any kind of security, as the one in prison. And this is the reason why today, when he is in prison, he has to stand up. We have to stand up because he's not only with the crisis in Libya, what's happening with the United States and Iran and their conflict, what is happening in Davos. Wouldn't it be beautiful to read revelations about it and to understand the world better? But it's not only about that anymore, it's about his life. It's about his future. And there is not much time left, as you know. The court hearing, the case is coming in February, and well, if you ask me, I would say this is something of the same magnitude as the famous Dreyfus affair. And if the Dreyfus affair teaches us anything, it is the fact that public pressure, organizing, even if I'm in this room and you're in that room, we are together, and organizing can lead to a successful future and to a successful fight for the freedom of Julian Assange. So thanks a lot for supporting the case, and what can I tell you? Soon I will be in your room and you will be in my room, and we are already together in this. And let me tell you that Julian knows and he respects a lot what everyone is doing to get him free.
Horvat of the M25, who are trying to change the debate in politics. It is quite interesting that we are all sitting here free, as are Blair and Bush and Hillary Clinton and all the war criminals, while the person suffering persecution and torture in Belmarsh maximum security prison is the person who did not commit a crime. And on that note, I'd like to invite somebody from Scotland to speak again. John White is a writer and a journalist, and I'd be delighted to introduce him to say a few words about Julian and the struggle.
Thank you very much, Deepa. Thank you to my fellow
panellists for making the effort to come to this meeting today, especially the ones that have come all the way from down south. Thank you to Stephen and Carol for organising this inaugural Scots Defend Assange meeting, and thanks to everyone who's made the effort to come here today. Such meetings have never been more important or more difficult to organise, what with this age of social media, wherein there can be a tendency, and I put my hand up to this myself, to lapse into a kind of torpor, whereby we make the mistake of substituting social media activism for the real thing. Social media is a fantastic tool, don't get me wrong, but one another, helping to raise one another's consciousness. This is what we fear most, the status quo that relies on our atomization, demoralisation and defeatism to prosper. We meet here today in defiance of the same status quo that would have us believe that this is the best of all possible worlds and that no meaningful change is possible. Another word for defiance, of course, is disobedience, which, if the Bible is to be believed, is man's original sin, but if Oscar Wilde is to be believed, is man's original virtue. Well, I don't know about you, but I have long since placed more store in the words of Oscar Wilde than in the words of the Bible. I'd also like to take a moment to pay tribute to those prisoners. Craig Murray touched upon their role in having Julian Assange released from his solitary confinement in Belmarsh. I tweeted last night that one hair on the head of one of those prisoners is worth more than all those within the media, political and legal establishment who would be part of it just goes to prove that there is no automatic association between a double-barreled name and common human decency. How appropriate is that we are meeting today on the day that Scotland celebrates the life and works of one of its most famous sons, Robert Rabbie Burns, a man who refused to go along to get along, who, despite the best efforts of his bourgeois chroniclers and biographers to sanitise his legacy, had the fire of rebellion and revolution pulsating through his veins, and a man who, like Julian Assange, spoke truth to power. Indeed, in words that could have been written with Julian Assange in mind, Burns once wrote, "The hypocrites, are these your pranks, to murder men and give God thanks? For shame, proceed no further, God won't accept your thanks for murder." Another great Scottish rebel who was around in the same period is Thomas Muir, whose legacy I think has gone grievously understated in this country. The man who is rightfully considered the father of Scottish democracy and who was sentenced to 14 years transportation, kind of like Julian Assange is facing for his role in resisting oppression in his time. Then we have the men of the 1820 Radical War, otherwise known as the Scottish Insurrection, who were inspired by Thomas Muir's work as head of the United Scotsmen, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. Moving forward, Mary Barber in Glasgow, who led the Rent Strikes, which was a catalyst for the rise of Red Clydeside, out of whom came John Maclean, who was sentenced to 6 years for sedition for his opposition to the First World War in 1918, and who in court famously said that I stand here not as the accused but as the accuser of capitalism dripping in blood from head to foot. Moving forward, we have Jimmy Reid, who was the leader of one of the leaders of the UCS working in the early 1970s, and who compared nationalism to electricity, saying that, like electricity, nationalism can kill a man in the electric chair or keep a baby alive in an incubator. Now, I go out of my way to articulate this litany of great Scottish rebels in the sure knowledge that many people in this room will be supporters of Scottish independence, a cause to which I am a late convert myself. But I urge you to make sure that the independent Scotland we fight for is more consonant with the values of Burns and Muir than it is with the value of Andrew Carnegie. We don't want an independent Scotland wherein the only change is the flag that flies over Edinburgh Castle. An independent Scotland whose head of state is the ludicrous institution of the monarchy, which retains sterling as its national currency and which is a member of NATO. To all intents, an independent Scotland which is a junior partner to the junior partner of an empire which exists not to advance the cause of democracy and human rights, but instead to advance the cause of white supremacy at the cost of human suffering. In 1846, a famous encounter took place in a jail in Concord, Massachusetts, between Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, two giants of 19th century American letters and two visionaries of the US Philosophical School of Transcendentalism. Thoreau had been sent to prison for refusing to pay his poll tax in protest at the institution of slavery, which at that point was legal throughout the entire United States. The Civil War, which ended slavery, was still 15 years into the future. And his great friend and contemporary, Ralph Waldo Emerson, visited him in prison, and it is said that as soon as he saw him, he said, "Henry, what on earth are you?" Injustice becomes law resistance becomes duty. But how to resist when you don't even know that you're living in a system of injustice? And this reminds me of the profundity encapsulated in the old saying that the best way to stop our prisoner from escaping is to make sure that he never knows that he's in prison. And thus I put it to you that in the purest philosophical, spiritual and intellectual sense, Julian Assange is not in prison, we are. The only reason that he's in Belmarsh right now is because he is a free man. He is a truly free man. Julian Assange has been to the mountaintop, to borrow the words of the great Martin Luther King, but what he saw there was not the promised land. What he saw was the hellish reality of Western foreign policy and what passes for democracy. A vast ocean of human skills, predominantly black and brown, made up of those deemed to exist outside the circle of human worth, erected to the god of Western imperialism and Western exceptionalism. And isn't it a grotesque perversity that not one of the perpetrators of this mass murder that's been taking place predominantly in the global south, Blair, Campbell, George W. Bush, Clinton, Barack Obama, David Cameron, has faced 1 second of justice for those crimes, yet Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, who've exposed those crimes, are the ones being crucified. And we have to understand that this is not just a moral issue, as important as the morality is, it's also an issue of material need when it comes to the kind of society we live here at home. As James Baldwin said, the assumptions acted upon at home are the assumptions acted upon abroad. And a racist society cannot but fight a racist war. There is a circular relationship between social and economic injustice at home and imperialism and war abroad. And then starting to join the dots, Julian Assange began to pull back the curtains and let the daylight in. And that's why he is deemed such a threat, and that's why he's being persecuted in the way that he is. The mainstream media in this country is an unalloyed disgrace. And I'm not just talking about the right-wing press, the pawn life of the Daily Mail and the Murdoch press. I'm talking more importantly about the so-called progressive media, specifically in the case of Julian Assange, the Guardian newspaper, which squeezed him out of their agenda, cast him aside, peremptorily rejected him and turned on him. These are not journalists. This is a rest home for every liberal centrist crank with a computer and an Oxbridge degree. These are ideological foot soldiers. Similarly, the BBC. The BBC is not so much a state broadcaster as an institution of the British state, which when threatened is deployed to protect the interests of the British state. People who campaigned for independence in 2014 will know what I mean. But more recently, the general election campaign, where we saw a man who spent 30 years on the backbenches in the House of Commons, a benign socialist and pacifist, an allotment tending, jam making, Quaker, fruit juice drinking, sandal wearing socialist. We were invited to believe that this man was the second coming of Reinhard Heydrich. The media is our enemy. That's why it's so important that these meetings take place, and that's why it's so important that we support social media and our own alternative media. Our alternative media we must view as the mainstream. That is the alternative media. That is to be marginalised, because these people are engaged in Julian Assange's suffering as a participant, not as an objective source of information that they would have us believe. The most recent legal proceedings, the most recent legal hearing at the Westminster Magistrates Court regarding Julian Assange's extradition case has Espionage Act. He has been refused to be allowed to use the First Amendment as part of his defence, and if he is extradited, he is facing special administrative measures. What does that mean? That means that we will be thrown into the void of the US Supermax system, completely cut off from humanity. Thus, we have it confirmed that the persecution of Julian Assange is a fascist endeavour. And thus, we have it confirmed that we do not need to look at Russia or Iran or Syria or Venezuela to find sources of freedom are ever idolised when dead, or crucified when alive. That our fundamental objective in this campaign is not only finding this place. Thank you. Thank you, John.
Wow. After that fantastic rousing speech from John, we'll just start taking a few questions. for the speakers, and I realise we're putting Lisa, John, and Helen in a kind of disadvantaged position without the rest of the speakers to answer for what they had to say. But what I'll try and do is take maybe one or two questions at a time and try and really get to the heart of them, and then add a few more if that's okay. So, does anybody have any burning questions they'd like to start off with? Very quiet one.
How do we go forward? I mean, in terms of being an activist and stuff, like tomorrow, what's the best thing I can do to push the ASSANGE agenda and let people know the injustice is happening?
Thank you. Dan's question was around how we as activists can really make change. And can I start with you, Helen, on that one?
I think the public meeting is the first thing. My view is that like I said in what I tried to say, it comes in two forms. One is supporting ASSANGE personally. Those sorts of things I think are really important signs of support. And the other thing, I think I sort of mentioned them really all in what I said. It's motions to your local trade union branches, motions to your local political. It may be religious groups, students. I mean, it's looking for all the possible friends that we have.
You know, the Labour Party and the SNP has from, well, actually not anyone within those organisations stood up.
I think is fear. I think people are afraid. Oppressive states.
Yeah.
We call it just, some of it is fear. For the Labour Party, there is a certain, among the leadership, there's a certain complicity in what happened, for instance, in Iraq. I mean, Keir Starmer was prosecuting ASSANGE. I'm not saying he was directly involved, but he was the head of the CPS. So I think that there's that in the leadership of the Labour Party. Corbyn and Diane Abbott did come out and made a statement to begin with, and my God, they had a hard time in Parliament. But they haven't said much since. Chris Williamson, of course, has been utterly smeared, but Chris Williamson's a and in other ways, I think the left really needs to look very, very hard at itself. Very, very hard indeed. Not only on this, on a lot of
That's very good. I think to add to that, don't forget the power of the international organising. I know that people, you were talking about setting up local groups, etc., but all over the world there are groups supporting the struggle against this extradition. And I know there's particularly a lot of organising going on in Australia, but if you look on the internet, you'll see there's loads of groups all over the world. So the fact that, you know, there's 50, 60 people here, it feels small, but that's actually quite big. It's a good turnout, you know, for a meeting. And I think that you're right. The thing is to break through the censorship and the witch hunt that there's been against Assange, and also never forget Chelsea Manning. You know, it's the two things: tackle people who are hostile, put the arguments, learn about the, you know, how to tackle the arguments by reading the material that's been put out.
I think a large part of the lack of support for Julian Assange is to do with the rape allegations. I think when these were made, they had the intended Pavlovian response. Everyone ran for cover. The Guardian ran for cover. A lot of the support ran for cover. Perhaps under a very, very serious crime. Lisa touched very eloquently on the process involved. But so are false allegations of rape. Nobody knows if they're false. We do know that Julian Assange was willing to be questioned by the Swedish authorities, but in the Ecuadorian embassy, and the Swedish authorities have precedents for questioning suspects abroad. They did it in a murder case, it is known. And he wanted a guarantee that he would not be extradited. They refused to give him that guarantee. I think all these campaigns at some point need to start linking up. I do think we need to build some big event in London, a conference, I'm inspired by the Russell Tribunal at the height of the Vietnam War. I think it's 1966, headed by Bertrand Russell. Tariq Ali was involved, Jean-Paul Sartre. They held a trial of the American imperialism in Sweden. We need to put these people on trial. We need to put on trial the people that put Julian Assange on trial and get a lot of big names coming over, especially Christine Assange, Julian Assange's mother. We need to bring her over because she is the moral face of this. A mother, a grieving mother, going through what she's going through, watching her son being persecuted this way, and the anguish that she must be going through. Julian Assange's father has also been heroic. This is a man in his late 70s, and he's travelling around the world. He should not be having to do this for his son at that age. He should be able to relax and enjoy life, or how many years he has left. And he's forced to go around the world crusading for his son. So I do think there needs to be some kind of convergence in all these campaigns, and we come together under a room. And we have to face the fact that there's a good chance that Julian Assange will be extradited. But the campaign cannot finish there. It must be ramped up. And the centre of gravity must move over to the States. There's some fantastic people in the States who are engaged in this.
If I may, can I just offer a few words as a trade unionist? STEP really is one of personal accountability, and for us to take responsibility for challenging the narrative. So I know, for example, in London, every time the newspaper puts out a thing saying Julian Assange charged with rape in Sweden, sends out a correct the record kind of request to them. And whether we correct the record online, whether we correct it in publications, we have to put these people on notice that their lives will no longer be tolerated. I think that is the first step. I think the other step, of course, the speakers have elaborated very well. On this note, I also wanted to highlight, I think on the Labour question, there is an event taking place on the 4th of February in London featuring John McDonnell. So Labour has finally managed to grow a spine, and they are coming out to, along with Jennifer Robinson, Neil Smeltzer, Tariq Ali and others, to condemn the blood sport that is the person interested, but may have friends in London who work in the legal profession, legal academics. There is a special event on the 3rd of November under the Free the Truth banner taking place in London, discussing torture, human rights and the legalities of the extradition. So if anybody's interested in that, please, the leaflets are on your seat. And I just wanted to pause a moment to point out that there's been a lot of meticulous organising that has gone through, right from setting up this event, booking the venue, etc. And it sometimes goes unnoticed. So long before the end, I'd like a round of applause for Carol and Stephen, who have spent a huge amount. And I urge you to wear your Scots Defend Assange badges. There's one on each seat for each of you. So there's some in the audience. This feels like one of my classes.
So I'm breaking the rules because this isn't a question, but I just wanted to pick up on what you said and say thank you to everyone who's spoken here and everyone who organised it, because I've been shamefully unaware until April 2019, which I guess is the date that everyone kind of did become aware of what was going on. And I've kind of tried to do little things myself, like I've been leafleting in Edinburgh, putting little stickers up, but it can be good, but it can also be isolating and it can be really defeating, because the amount of people that I've had that have said, he's a rapist, and therefore associated me, so I really, really appreciate, Lisa, what you said, but this is just fantastic to have other people and to not feel like you're on your own. And it is like the messages of hope and the kind of like videos were great, because I think it is. I am feeling hopeful, and I just wanted to say thank you so much, because it really does mean a lot. Not that it's about me, but it does, it really does. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Anybody else with observations or questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, in what you were saying about getting politicians to grow a spine, I think what we can do as well is that we can actually go and visit the surgeries of all our MSPs and all our MPs and say to them that they must support this campaign or a motion or whatever. We can actually do that. It's one of the successful things in the TTIP as well, was actually going around, and a lot of them will not want to do it, but I think if the more and more we pressurise them we'll get some successes, maybe not with everybody, but we'll get some successes. I think that's quite important.
On that note, if you have any local council elections, any other questions or comments? Yes, please.
Every single MSP, and I personally wrote to every Scots MP that represents us in the UK Parliament. I fully support what's happening to Julian Assange. I have been following this case closely for a number of years. My own personal experience is I was targeted and persecuted myself for surveillance for uncovering corruption and fraud. I subsequently found that I was being intercepted on behalf of the UK government. I was locked up in a mental institution for complaining to the police about the surveillance. But my question is, and what I fear, my biggest fear is, I contacted no less than 14 human rights lawyers in the Glasgow area when it was happening to me 3 years ago, or to take my case on. I was then left at the mercy of the UK intelligence services. So my question and observation is, when it's the ordinary people in the street who are being targeted and for surveillance, there is a lack of understanding or appreciation within the legal framework. We're just not getting access to the right representation. There is nothing for people like me out there. And I'm here also with a friend from Edinburgh who's also been a victim of this. What can we do as individuals to enlighten the mass population about what is really going on in this country? Because it's happened to me 3 years ago and is still continuing.
One more question, and then we can try and get the speakers to answer both questions together. Any more questions? Well, that's.
Sure. I think it's important to stop thinking of ourselves as individuals and acting as such. We have to think of ourselves as a collective. That's why this meeting is so important. This is the acme of collectivism and collective ideas. And so we act as a collective and we exert solidarity not only on behalf of Julian Assange but on behalf of each other. But really good that you've come here and shared your story. And from now on, this movement has to grow on that basis that we are all part of the same movement and we act as such and we support each other in the process of supporting Julian Assange. So I don't think you really need to feel you have to rely on lawyers. You rely on the movement. It's the movement that's going to progress this cause. It's the movement that's going to develop all of us in the process and support one another and give us all renewed strength. That's the only thing I would say with regards to that.
I think that's absolutely right. You know, we can only be strong when we're collective and we're accountable to each other. And in the course of building the movement, that is when the lawyers will also take a position. Because frankly, a lot of lawyers are cowards and they don't want to take on difficult cases, and some of them are lazy and a lot of them are overworked. But, you know, people who are in trouble need support, and we need to support each other because we need each other.
I just wanted to say a big thank you to some people whom I've not mentioned so far. Elizabeth Armstrong, who has supported with the event throughout, and also another thank you again to Emmy Buckland, who has been helping with the organisation of the event. I'd like to remind you of the 4 areas that you may wish to campaign on. One is the criminalisation of journalism. The second is state-sponsored torture of a journalist and publisher. The third is the extraterritorial reach of the US state, which will apply to many other journalists and which is something you can use for lists. And lastly, and perhaps most important to many of us, the suppression of dissent that allows us to hold states and others accountable. On that note, I would also like to direct you to the work of Professor Niels Melzer, the UN Rapporteur on Torture, and John Pilger, who have both written extensively on this. I'd also like to direct you to historian Mark Curtis, markcurtis.info, who's done a phenomenal amount of work on the conflicts of interest within the supervising judge at Westminster Magistrates Court in relation to her husband being featured, I think, 64 times in WikiLeaks and her son having relationship with the US deep state. So these are things that are worth surfacing, and having these facts and arming yourself them helps to dispel some of the myths. So thank you again to Dan for his wonderful artwork, and to Somerset Bean for the posters, Beth Bogart for the video we saw on collateral murder at the start, and to Helen, Craig, Anna, Shreko, John, Lisa, sorry, I can't even see him.
Gordon.
And the one person who is helping us to communicate with those people outside Belmarsh, and who's been helping us communicate our ideas so clearly and so effectively through his work. Thank you, Gordon, for all that you've done to help surface the message. And thank you, all of you, for making the time on Saturday afternoon to come and listen to everybody speak and to support the movement and show solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepa. Hi everyone, so that's the end of the Scots for Assange meeting, and I'm going to now hopefully start dropping videos from Belmarsh, which is going on at the same time, which have been sent to me. Thanks to everybody who made this possible, and I shall see you again soon. Take care.